Good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Sheep. I'm your host for tonight, Ciaran Lynch, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues, our fellow panelists tonight, Dr. Orla Keane from the Animal Bioscience Research Centre in Grange, and my fellow sheep specialist, Michael Gottstein. Our focus tonight is on parasite control in the early part of the grazing season, with specific focus on Nematodirus and Coccidia and some other related issues at this stage of the year. Again, look, we like to try and keep these webinars interactive, so I would encourage you to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any questions for either of our panelists on either topics, we'll endeavour to ask them during the presentation. And whatever we don't get to, we'll do a wrap-up session at the tail end. Up first tonight, we have Dr. Orla Keane, and Orla's going to discuss Nematodirus and some related issues. Orla, you're very welcome on. I might just ask you to turn on your camera and mute, and I might get you to start sharing your screen. Okay, we have you there. So again, if you have any questions for Orla, we'll have an opportunity at the end of our first part of the talk to go through some of the key issues around the Nematodirus, and then Orla will come back in again and maybe discuss some other aspects of parasite control early in season. Before we swap over to Michael.
Sorry about that, Ciaran. Just
okay.
few slight technical hitches there. So
yeah, we have your slides up now, so we have Orla. So I'll hand over to yourself. I'll come back into you.
Just check that that's okay there. No, you can see everything.
That's perfect. We have you loud and clear. So look, I'll come back to you, Orla, at the end. Again, for anyone who has any questions for Orla, type them in the Q&A tab and we'll ask them once she's concluded the first part of the presentation. So Orla, I'll hand over to you with that.
Okay, so thanks very much. So as Ciaran mentioned there, what we're going to discuss this evening will be around Nematodirus and Coccidia in lambs, two parasites that can be a problem at this time of year. So I'll focus now for the next kind of 15 or 20 minutes or so on Nematodirus, and then hand over to Michael, who'll talk about Coccidia. So I'll cover a little bit on the Nematodirus life cycle, and this is because the life cycle of this particular parasite is a little bit different to some of the other gutworms, and some of those differences are quite important. The Department of Agriculture Nematodirus forecast was released last week, so I'll just have a quick kind of run through that forecast and what that means. And then I'll touch on prevention of Nematodirus where possible, the clinical signs of Nematodirus and how we treat for Nematodirus. And that will lead into one of the 4 key actions that people can take to slow the development of anthelmintic resistance on sheep farms in Ireland. Okay, so throughout their life, sheep and lambs are exposed to a variety of different parasites. And the major parasites of concern will depend on the time of the year and the age of the animal that we're talking about. So at this time of year, in the springtime, the 2 parasites that are of concern in young lambs are Coccidia and Nematodirus. So Coccidia may be of concern slightly earlier, but what you can see there is that there's a significant overlap in the risk period for Coccidia and for Nematodirus, and they can be at times quite difficult to tell apart. For both of these parasites, though, immunity develops quite quickly. So really, they're parasites that are a problem in young lambs, but when lambs get a little bit of exposure, they develop their immunity, and usually they're no longer a problem from the time the lambs are maybe about 3 months old on, and they're not a problem in older sheep. So Nematodirus is a little bit different. It is a gutworm, but it's a little bit different from some of the other gutworms that are common later on in the season, the type of gutworms that you'll find from kind of June on. And a few of the important differences that I'd like to highlight here. So the first one is that the Nematodirus egg is very, very different to the eggs of the other gutworm species. So what this means is that we can distinguish the Nematodirus egg from the other types of eggs. So the parasites that are a problem later on in the season, the likes of Teladorsagia and Trichostrongylus, Couperia, all their eggs look very, very similar under the microscope. We can't tell them apart, so we can't necessarily say which species it is that's causing a problem. The Nematodirus eggs are very clearly distinct, and so we can always distinguish out this parasite. Its life cycle, as I mentioned, it's a little bit different. And in the next slide, I'll just cover a little bit more about what it is about this parasite. about this parasite's life cycle that's a little bit different. And then the other difference is in terms of how quickly immunity develops. So normally once lambs are exposed, they develop immunity reasonably quickly, and usually by the time they're about 3 months of age or so, they have reasonable immunity to Nematodirus. And that again is different from the stomach worms and the gut worms that come along later. So for those other mid-season gut worms, it usually takes about a year for immunity to develop. But for Nematodirus, it develops quite quickly. And this means if you are, for example, doing fecal egg count, so later on in the season, and it does come back with a positive count for Nematodirus, it's generally not, they're generally not a problem. They usually have immunity by that stage and by that age. So just in terms of the life cycle, as I mentioned, it's a little bit different from the other gut worms. So just like the other gut worms, the eggs are passed out in the dung of an infected animal. However, and this is one of the differences between them, those eggs then develop into L1, L2, and L3 stage larvae within the egg. So the very, very big eggs, and they develop to the L3 stage within the egg. The L3 then hatches out from the egg onto the grass, and this is the infective stage. And there are very, very particular conditions that are required for the L3 to hatch out of the egg. So what the egg needs, it needs to be chilled, followed by a warming. So what you find, and that warming has to be, above 10 degrees. So generally what you find is that the eggs are chilled during a cold spell over winter. And then when this is followed by a warm spell, when the soil temperature gets up above 10 degrees, the eggs can then hatch. So what you can get when the weather conditions are right is you can get a synchronized hatching, where all of the eggs hatch at the same time. Therefore, you can get a huge number of these infective L3 being released onto pasture at the same time. And if that coincides with when there are young susceptible lambs grazing that pasture, you can get very severe infections. So when susceptible animals graze that pasture and pick up these infective larvae, the larvae develop through into adults. Those adults lay eggs, and those eggs are passed out with the dung onto the pasture. So what that means is that Nematodirus is a lamb crop to lamb crop infection. So the Nematodirus that's hatching this spring, it's hatching from eggs that were deposited onto the pasture by last year's lambs. And this year's lambs will pass out eggs that will infect next year's lambs. And so therefore, it takes about a year for Nematodirus to complete its life cycle. So it's much, much slower than the gut worms that come later on in the season. Those gut worms can develop through in as quick as 5 weeks. They can complete their life cycle. So the fact that Nematodirus is quite slow to complete its life cycle, it means that anthelminthic resistance develops much more slowly in this parasite than in the gut worms that come later on in the season. So as of yet, we haven't identified a case of anthelminthic resistance in Nematodirus in Ireland. So where the big risk from Nematodirus comes is from when you get this synchronized hatching, and when that synchronized hatching corresponds with when you have young susceptible lambs eating enough grass to get infected. So usually you're talking about lambs from about 6 weeks of age on. That's when they're eating sufficient grass to pick up an infection. And when those two things come together, you can get very, very severe infections. It can result in mortality, in significant numbers of mortality. And even where it doesn't result in mortality, it can do very severe damage to the gastrointestinal tract of the lamb, and they may never fully recover. So they'll always be left, with this damage, and they'll won't thrive in the future. So it's really, important to kind of be proactive, to get on top of it, to be aware of it, and to be looking at the risk factors. And some animals may be a little bit more susceptible than others, depending on the amount of grass that they're eating. So for example, twin lambs or lambs from a ewe of poor milking ability, they may start to eat grass a little bit sooner. They may be consuming a little bit more grass, and they may be that little bit more susceptible. And one thing to remember is that it is the larval stage of the parasite that does the damage. This is before they develop into adults and before they start laying eggs. So fecal egg counts are not necessarily that useful in predicting predicting the disease. Now, as I mentioned, we know the conditions required for Nematodirus to hatch. It's this extended period of cold followed by warmer weather. And so this means we can predict when the parasite eggs will hatch, and the Department of Agriculture do that, and they produce every year a Nematodirus forecast. So the Nematodirus forecast for 2021, it was released last Thursday. And this was actually a week earlier than average. So the hatch was a little bit earlier this year. And it's actually 3 weeks earlier than last year. I know last year some people thought maybe they'd missed it because it was quite late. So, you know, it will vary from year to year depending on the weather conditions at the time. So it is important to always kind of keep an eye out for it. So this figure is reproduced from the forecast produced by the department. And what it shows is it shows the predicted peak hatching date of Nematodirus at various locations around the country based on soil temperature data from Met Éireann. So any number there in orange, that is a date in April, and any number in red is a date in March. So what you can see around the country is that for certain parts of the country, the peak hatch is actually predicted to be this week. However, in other parts of the country, so for example, up in Donegal and the northwest, the peak hatch was last week. And down in the southwest of the country, the peak hatch was actually the end of March. The other thing to bear in mind about this is that this is based on soil temperature data from Met Éireann, but depending on where you are, there may be local kind of microenvironment or microclimatic conditions that might affect when the hatch occurs on your farm. So these are predicted dates based on Met Éireann data, but there may be some local effects on when the hatching occurs. Now, as I mentioned, the other thing just to bear in mind is that, as I said there, we know the conditions under which Nematodirus hatches, and it's this chilling followed by warming. So it is possible for Nematodirus to hatch at other times of the year other than the spring if the conditions are right. And if that hatching at another time of year coincides with when susceptible lambs are available, you can get diseases at other time of the year. Now that is quite rare, but I suppose one of the things that we need to be aware of is that if our climate becomes more unpredictable, or if it changes in some way, that may affect the risk periods for Nematodirus. But generally it's a spring disease. We can predict when the parasite hatches, and the major risk is when this hatch coincides with susceptible lambs grazing that pasture. Okay, so how do we prevent it? Well, as I mentioned, it's a lamb crop to lamb crop disease. So the lambs from this year are infected by eggs that were shed from lambs last year. So one way to avoid it, to prevent it, is to avoid grazing ground that was grazed by lambs the previous spring. Now, Nematodirus batis can also infect calves. So ground that's been grazed by calves the previous spring can also be considered risky. Now that's probably not going to be practical for a certain number of people, for a significant number of people, but where it is practical, that's something that can be done. As I mentioned, certain lambs, so twin lambs or nutritionally challenged lambs, may be eating more grass and they may be more susceptible. And immunity does develop quite quickly. So usually by the time they're about 12 weeks of age, they have immunity. The clinical signs of Nematodirus, I suppose some of these are maybe a little bit non-specific, but the major sign would be profuse diarrhea, and this can lead to fecal staining of the back legs. The lambs will be dull or depressed and may stop suckling. This diarrhea will lead to dehydration, and one of the signs can be that the lambs congregate around water troughs due to thirst. They can lose weight and body condition and become quite gaunt, and it can result in significant lamb mortality. And as I said, that's one of the reasons to be very aware of this parasite and proactive in dealing with this parasite. Treatment is generally based on the assessment of risk factors. So risk factors would be the age of the lamb. So young lambs, they generally become, they start consuming significant amounts of grass from about 6 weeks on, and this would be a risk factor. And when the peak hatches, as predicted by the Department of Agriculture Nematodirus forecast. And when those two things coincide, that's particularly high risk. But there are also clinical signs that I just mentioned there that may indicate issues with nematodirus, as well as just the age and the nematodirus forecast. Now, if you're treating based on the forecast, it's recommended to treat approximately 2 weeks after the peak egg hatch and to treat with a product from the benzimidazole class of anthelmintics. So that's the white doses. And the reason why we recommend the white doses, I'll cover later on. So of course, when the treatment is, it will depend on where you are in the country. So, for the southwest of the country, you're probably talking about have treated by now if you have lambs that are at risk. For other parts of the country, treating maybe this week or the final 2 weeks in April. And of course, as always, when you are dosing lambs, make sure that you use a good dosing technique, that you're delivering the correct amount of the anthelmintic based on the weight of the lamb, and that the gun is calibrated. Repeat treatment for nematodirus may be required. So none of the products have any residual activity against nematodirus, and so the lambs may remain at risk, particularly in situations of where there's maybe heavily stocked farms where there's a lot of contamination on pasture, or where you've grazing groups with lambs of different ages. So for example, at the moment, there may be older lambs in a group that would be at risk because they're consuming significant amounts of grass. However, younger lambs might be less at risk because they're not yet consuming a significant amount of grass. However, in 2 to 3 weeks' time, those younger lambs may need treatment. So repeat treatment may be required. And if treating a second time, we would recommend, again, it's always with benzimidazole with the white drench product. So the same product if a repeat treatment is required. The damage is generally caused by the larval stage of the parasite. So before the parasite starts to lay eggs. So fecal egg count at this stage is not particularly useful in diagnosing the disease. However, if there is a problem, we would recommend submitting dead lambs for postmortem to a regional veterinary lab, as this can help get to the bottom of what an issue is and to distinguish and diagnose if nematodirus is a problem. So of all the anthelmintic products on the market, they fall into one of 5 classes, but the vast majority of products fall into one of the first 3 classes. The benzimidazoles are white drenches, levamisoles are yellow drenches, or macrocyclic lactones are clear drenches. And the final 2 products, the orange and the purple, they're available on prescription only. And as I said, we would always recommend treating with a white dose of benzimidazole and only a benzimidazole. Now, some anthelmintics have residual activity, but it's important to remember that residual activity is not against nematodirus. It is against the stomach worms and gut worms that are a problem later on in the season, like Teledursagia. No product has residual activity against nematodirus. So, there's no point in using a product that has residual activity thinking it will protect you for a period of time against nematodirus. Now, the reason we recommend benzimidazole is very straightforward. The product is very, very effective. It will target both the larval and the adult stage of the parasite. The reason for specifically this product is we know that for the mid-season gutworms, there is a problem on most Irish sheep farms with resistance to benzimidazole. So this product is it's likely that it can't be used later in the season to control the mid-season gutworms. So what we recommend is you use benzimidazole to control nematodirus and to preserve the other 2 classes of product, the levamisole and the macrocyclic lactones, for later in the season when they may still be effective. And as I mentioned earlier, we've not recorded any instance of anthelmintic resistance in nematodirus in Ireland. There's been a small number of cases recorded in the UK, so it may arise, but for now, we have no evidence of resistance in this parasite to any of the 3 classes of anthelmintic. So we would always recommend benzimidazole. And this leaflet may be familiar to some of you, as you would have received it with your sheep census. And so what it is it just outlines 4 actions that people can take to slow the development of anthelminthic resistance on their farm. And it's generally about slowing development of resistance in the mid-season gutworms. And what you'll see there is that action 2 is to only use the products from the benzimidazole class to treat Nematodirus in lambs. And this is to preserve the other classes for use later on in the season. Okay, so I think at that point, I'm happy to take any questions or hand you over to Michael.
Okay, thanks, Orla. We might just take a couple of questions. I'll let you catch your breath for a moment, Orla. Just like to remind attendees, you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and ask any questions of Orla or Michael later on. And again, we'll try and come back at the tail end to wrap up anything that wasn't covered at the moment. Orla, maybe just to start, like, look, it's certainly topical at the moment. We're a really high risk period. So for lambs born then the February, start of March, like the risk for them is at the moment. They would need treatment even, would you recommend even before we see signs of it, or?
So basically, if they're consuming grass, and then they will be at risk. So yes, you would recommend treatment before you see signs. If you wait to see signs, it may be a little late.
Okay, and just in part, Patrick has a question in, and you covered it in part in your presentation. The minimum age that lambs can get Nematodirus at, and I know there might be some confusion with coccidiosis. I think Michael's going to deal with that in a bit more detail, but we're generally saying from 5 weeks on, but there is a bit of caveats around that. So maybe you just explain that a bit more.
Yeah, so it is about, so generally we'd say from kind of 5 to 6 weeks on is when they will be consuming enough grass to pick up enough of an infection to cause a problem. But it is really about how much grass they're taking in. The more grass they're eating, the more likely they are to pick up an infection. So the likes of lambs that are, maybe twin lambs, so they're more likely to start consuming grass earlier or to consume more grass, or if the ewe is not milking well, then they'll be consuming more grass and they'll be at higher risk earlier on.
And there might be more compromise in other ways as well.
Yeah.
Look,
so
in part, that kind of ties in, like, so you mentioned about the need for repeat dose, and frequently we encouraging people from a grassland point of view to group up sheep at this stage. I suppose the challenge for that, Orla, is them early lambs are susceptible at the moment, will need to be treated, but the later born lambs in March might be at higher risk at the moment. So they need to come back in and repeat treatment, and maybe the interval on that.
Yeah, so you're probably looking at about 2 to 3 weeks in terms of the interval. So those lambs will need to be treated in the future. So a repeat treatment is likely to be required. You're probably looking at about a 2 to 3 week interval, and again with the same product, with the product from the benzimidazole class.
And again, in that case, you'd be treating the whole group anyway at that second treatment option.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, again, I'd encourage anyone who has any questions on that. The Q&A tab is there at the bottom. We can come back to aspects of that later on. Or maybe if we just move on slightly, like one of the other issues around parasite control at this stage of the year is that whole area of dosing ewes. Should we dose them? Shouldn't we dose them? I know it's one you put up the leaflet there with the key actions. One of our first actions on it to maintain our products and really protect refugia. I might just get you to explain a little bit more because it is topical at the moment. So I might just hand it back over to you there and let you go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just going back to that leaflet that people will have received. So, of course, the number one action on that leaflet is not to treat mature ewes for stomach worms unless there is a demonstrated need. So I think, there's a few kind of caveats around this, but in general, healthy mature ewes shouldn't need treatment for stomach worms. Now, what people, may well be aware of is that the egg count of the ewes will rise. Their immunity will relax a little bit around lambing. And so they'll get this rise in fecal egg count from maybe about 2 weeks pre-lambing to about 6 weeks post-lambing. It's known as the periparturient rise. And so I suppose one of the reasons that people historically treated ewes around lambing for gutworms was to knock out the periparturient rise. And so this is just a graph here that shows the gutworm larval contamination on pasture throughout the year. So generally, the contamination of pasture will start to decline into the spring, and then you'll have these eggs shed out onto pasture by the yolks due to the periparturient rise. But these are going out onto the pasture at a time that the pasture contamination might be low. So these eggs are a source of contamination for lambs. Later on in the year, lambs will start to pick them up and they will start to cycle through the lambs. So the big risk, one of the big risks is that if you treat yolks and if you treat them with a product that is not 100% effective, and you need to know it's 100% effective, what happens is that that treatment will kill all the susceptible worms in the yolk. The resistant worms will survive, and the eggs from those resistant worms will be shed out onto pasture. And that means you seed your pasture at the start of the grazing season with eggs from resistant worms. So the lambs then start to take in the larvae from these resistant worms. And that means you're effectively compromising the efficacy of your anthelmintic treatments to your lambs later on in the season. So there's a risk there in treating yolks. I mean, if the product is not fully effective. The other thing about treating yolks is, the reason people were doing it was to reduce pasture contamination later on in the season, which means you should be reducing your lamb treatments accordingly, and people weren't necessarily doing that. But the big risk is that the treatment of these, if it's not 100% effective, it will put out resistant parasites onto your pasture that the lambs will pick up. They'll cycle through the lambs and you can develop anthelmintic resistance quite quickly. Whereas if you leave the lambs untreated, these are a source of parasites for which there's no selection pressure for resistance. So they're a source of refugia, as you mentioned there, Ciaran, and that will slow the development of anthelmintic resistance. So I think it's really a key point at this time of year, and it's a really key action to slow the development of resistance.
Okay, thanks for that, Orla. Look, we've just a quick question in there from Kenneth, and I think you covered it in part. The yolks are contaminating the pasture, but it's the risk of contaminating with resistant worms and speeding up that whole resistance process in your farm.
Yeah, so they are contaminating the pasture, and that was the rationale behind treating them. But in order to take advantage of that yolk treatment, you need to be reducing the lamb treatments accordingly, which people were not necessarily doing. But the big risk, now that we know anthelmintic resistance is out there and we know it's reasonably common, is if you treat them with a product that is not 100% effective, then you're setting yourself up for problems later on in the grazing season.
It's a trade-off for that long-term maintaining that product efficacy. That's what we're looking at. Or I just might get you to stop sharing your screen and get Michael to start his. But we're waiting on Michael. We have a question there from Sam, just back about Nematodirus again. Older lambs, them early spring-born lambs, are they at risk of it? And they're probably at risk of the other stomach worms at this stage of the year too.
Yeah, they may be at risk. So I suppose they need to be exposed to the parasite to develop their immunity. So if they haven't been exposed previously, then they will still be at risk. So the age-based immunity is also about having previous exposure to allow that immunity to develop.
Okay, but again, look, the Nematodirus will be a big risk at the moment because of that mass hatching.
Yeah, because you get this mass hatch.
Okay, and look, I know there'll be a few more questions coming in about the yolks and that later on. Again, I would encourage anyone to use that Q&A tab. We'll come back to some aspects of it later. Michael, I might just get you to turn on your camera and unmute.
Okay.
Welcome you on. We'll give Orla a break and we can come back to it at the end. So if there is any other questions for Orla, we'll come back at the end. Michael, you're going to cover coccidiosis, and I have your slides up now.
Just can you tell me when you see them?
I have them up now, so I'll let you just go up full screen with your slides. Yep. We're good to go. So look, I'll hand over to you now, and I'll come back to you at the end for any questions. So.
Okay, thanks, Ciaran. Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody. So look, I'm going to talk a little bit, as Ciaran said, about coccidiosis, and again, I think the two diseases are very much intertwined, happen at the same time. So look at what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an introduction about the disease, about the parasite, chat about the symptoms. A lot of this is going to be very similar to what Orla has talked about. A little bit about prevention, how can we reduce the infection challenge, and then a little bit about control and a couple of take-home messages. And then we'll take a few questions and answers. So look at coccidiosis. It's caused by a really, really tiny microscopic parasite belonging to the species of Emeria. And there are many species of Emeria found in sheep. And that's the important thing. There's loads and loads and loads of different species of Emeria. I think it's 10 or 11 species that are found in sheep, but there's only 2 of those that cause disease. And those are these 2 here in italics there, if you want a fancy Latin name there, Ovinodalis and Crandidalis. Not sure that anyone will need that information, but they're the guys really that they're pathogenic, or they cause disease. The other ones don't. If they have lots of the other Coccidia species inside them, not doing any harm, they're just living away happily there inside them. I suppose the other thing is all sheep carry a small number of Coccidia. So when we do a dung sample in sheep, it's not unusual to get a Coccidia count. And the Coccidia count really doesn't mean that they have disease, that the Coccidia are causing any harm. And I suppose the other point there is that Coccidia can survive in the environment for long periods of time. So it's a pretty robust parasite, very similar to Nematodirus. You can get year-to-year infection, you know, and it's a pretty tough little bugger to get rid of. So very young lambs, when they're born, we reckon for the first 2 weeks roughly, provided they've got enough colostrum from the O, they have that maternal immunity. So it's very rare that we see coccidiosis in lambs kind of under 2 weeks of age. Really, the period of risk is once the lambs are kind of between 3 and 8 weeks of age. And generally, we say that in healthy lambs, you know, where nutrition is right and there's no other health issues, that most lambs will develop immunity really by the time they're 10 to 12 weeks of age. How is the disease spread? So the disease really needs moisture. It's a little parasite that basically needs water for the oocysts to hatch into infective stages, and basically splashing muck around the place helps get it into feeders, into water trucks, you know, so that the lambs are infected with it. So we can see here is a creep feeder, typical of what we probably saw a couple of weeks ago. Not, you know, overly muddy, but quite muddy, and you can see there obviously the lambs are dunging there where they're feeding, and then they're splashing and standing into the truck, and there's dung and dirt and muck and being carried in, and that's basically how it happens around water trucks, creep feeders, poorly ventilated and poorly bedded animal housing. So in terms of the symptoms, very, very similar to Nematodirus. So, you know, we're seeing kind of very often we're saying, okay, is it one, is it the other, is it both? So a severe scour. With coccidiosis, sometimes we get a bit of blood in the scour, or it can be black in color, very black, and that's basically, you know, blood as well that has gone through the digestive tract. But not always. Doesn't have to be that way. Affected lambs again will strain, you know, be very uncomfortable, you know, profuse scouring, similar to what Orla was talking about in the Nematodirus. And again, they may congregate around water trucks if they, you know, because they're thirsty. With coccidiosis, in the same as with Nematodirus, you know, we can see high mortality where in severe infections, where treatment is delayed or where treatment is absent. And in addition to these dead lambs, which we hope to avoid, but very often what we do see is, you know, for every couple of lambs that's dead, there's a whole pile more that are very badly damaged by the parasite that will survive because, okay, they've been treated before they got to the stage where they were going to die, but they have such irreversible damage done to their digestive tract that they'll be poor doers. These are lambs that are, you know, just poor lambs, never really thrive after it. The disease occurs around the same time as Nematodirus. So, you know, we're saying our Nematodirus generally comes in there when the lambs start eating grass around 5-6 weeks. You know, same with the coccidia, maybe a small little bit earlier. Can see cocci also inside in sheds, I suppose. It's not just when they go out onto grass. We see that in house lambs as well. Again, okay, if you get the 2 parasites at the same time, obviously makes the situation a whole pile worse. You know, and the severity of the infection can be greater, and obviously the response to treatment can be poor if it doesn't come in time. So how do we prevent the disease? And you know, I suppose it's difficult to prevent these diseases, and that's why they're quite common. but the oocysts need water to become infective to the lamb. So the little eggs that are passed out, we call them oocysts, they're not going to do anything unless there's moisture in the environment. So that's a way, I suppose, that we can reduce or try to reduce the level of infection. So reducing overcrowding indoors, so maybe in your pet lamb pens or if you have indoor ewes lambing indoors in the winter time, and they're being held in for a number of weeks. Good ventilation, plenty of bedding, anything that keeps it clean and dry, helps keep the bed dry. Regularly moving feeders, so that's when we go outside for people that are feeding ewes outside, and the lambs will be eating with them, or feeding lambs with creep feeders or in trucks or whatever system you're using. Regularly moving that to prevent it from getting muddy outside. Okay, very simple at the moment when the weather is dry, not that easily done when we have the type of weather that we had, a couple of weeks ago, where it's raining incessantly every day. Raise the feeders so that they're less likely to be contaminated with feces. Again, it's easier said than done, but it is a prevention method, particularly for lambs maybe indoors. And raise the water trucks and the area around them. And I think that's probably one where we can reasonably do a good bit of work, is keep the water trucks up to prevent them from dunging into them and jumping into them and things like that with their legs. But also the area around water trucks, in particular in the fields, like what happens is, eventually a ball cock will break, or, the area gets muddy around it, and over a period of time, there's a hollow develops around the water truck, which is always wet then because the water's flowing in there. So maybe putting a bit of hardcore or chip around the water truck just so that the water runs away from it and that area is clean. Those are things that can help. These are not going to eliminate it on farms that have a problem with coccidiosis, but they can help reduce the severity of the infection and the severity of the challenge. Older lambs. Okay, so the lambs, basically, when they lose their immunity, they start churning out huge amount of these oocysts during the time when they become infected. So you see huge numbers, and when we do an egg count, anyone that sends away a fecal sample, generally you don't get a count for coccidia. It's a kind of a high, medium, or low count because there's just loads of them there. So like these older lambs are basically passing out huge amounts of these onto the pasture. Even after they've become immune, they're still churning out big numbers of these oocysts. And basically, if we come with a younger batch of lambs after an older batch of lambs, let's say on our second rotation, let's say if we had some lambs there that were born in early February and we had them running around the farm, and now in April we're coming in there with young lambs, late March born lambs or something like that. That's a bad idea, because this pasture now is really contaminated with these oocysts. It's not going to affect the older lambs because they are at this stage are immune, but our young lambs are really susceptible. So really what we're trying to do, I suppose, where you have different age groups of lambs is until they get to that stage where they're immune, which is that kind of 10, 12 weeks, give them a separate grazing area, an area that hasn't been grazed by lambs just a couple of weeks or a month or 6 weeks earlier. In terms of treatment then, so when we talk about treatment, there are really two options available to us. There's in-feed medication. So that's basically where you buy creep feed or a lamb pencil or a lamb nut, which has a medication in it. Not that simple, but is available. There's you need a miller who is licensed to medicate feed. You need a prescription from your vet for that feed, and then you get a batch made up. Or oral drenches, that's the second option. And I suppose that's probably what's most commonly used by most people is the oral drenches in terms of controlling the disease. So just to go through it first in no particular order, the in-feed one. So the the product we're using there is called Teagasc. That's the trade name for the medication that goes into the feed. And generally the recommended rate is between 1.67 and 3.34 kgs of that Teagasc per ton of feed. So the miller would be putting that in based on the prescription that he would get from your vet. And then depending on how much is put in, you basically dose the lambs accordingly. You offer them that amount of feed. So at the higher inclusion rate there of the 3.34 kilograms, 50 grams per 10 kgs of live weight is what the lambs would need to take in to be medicated, to be fully medicated. So for a 20 kilo lamb, at that inclusion rate, you'd be hoping that the lamb, once the lamb would be taking 100 grams of creep a day, he'd be getting the full full amount of decox, and that would eliminate any coccidia infections and prevent them from getting reinfected. At the lower inclusion rate of 1.67 kilograms, it's half it. You'd have to go with twice the amount of feed per 10 kgs of live weight. So again, our 20 kilo lamb here would need to be getting 100 grams per 10 kgs or 200 grams a day of medicated feed. Generally feed it for 28 days. That's what's recommended. So you do the full course, and then you do it during the high risk period. So for most people, if you were doing this, you'd want to be introducing creep probably to the lambs around kind of 3 weeks of age, 3 or 4 weeks of age, when that risk period is there, and continuing on for about 4 weeks. There's no withdrawal period from a meat point of view for that, so it's not an issue for lambs coming close to slaughter. So then the drenches, I suppose the drenches are a bit cheaper. You don't have to feed meal to get it in there, so for a lot of people would say that wouldn't be creeping lambs, particularly maybe March born lambs might be doing the system off a grass-based system and avoiding going in with creep that early. Drenching is the way to go. So we've 2 different active ingredients that are available. With toltrazural and diclozural, so they're the 2 active ingredients, and I've listed the trade names there of all the ones that are on the HPRA website today. Just pull them off, the ones that are licensed there for sheep. So you've got Baycox, Bovicox, Shanox, Coxaclear, Ridocox, Tolracol, and Tatrol. Look at, they all have the same active ingredient. We're not promoting any particular product here on the call, but it's just there. That's what's available. It's an oral drench. You'll be given about 4 mils there. The dose rate is 4 mils per 10 kgs of live weight. So generally, most people will be dosing lambs around 15 to 20 kilos. You'll be talking about somewhere between 6 and 8 mls. The toltrazural, the first one here, kills all stages of the parasite, and that generally means it's a one-shot treatment. A lot of people will be going in there maybe at 3 or 4 weeks of age. Lamb is a bit lighter, you'll have a lower dose rate, and cleaning them out and getting away really with the one-shot treatment. There is a 42-day meat withdrawal period on this one. And it's not recommended there for animals that are intensively fed indoors or over 6 weeks of age or 20 kgs, just from an environmental point of view in terms of disposing of the dung. These are for intensively indoor finished lambs, or we'll say some people might have pet lambs indoors on ad lib concentrates finishing them. The diclozural, that's marketed as decoxin or Vcoxin. Again, it's an oral drench. Same family of products, so it's closely related to the toltrazural. It's not a totally different active. Again, the same dose rate, 4 mils per 10 kgs. Generally, doesn't kill kill all the stages of the parasite. So what we're seeing with that is sometimes in severe infections, people have to come back in again 3 weeks later. Maybe go in with the first one, kind of 4 or 5 weeks, and then go back in again, maybe at 7 or 8 weeks. A 0 meat withdrawal period with this one as well. Look at anytime we're talking about drenching, we're talking about the importance of proper drenching. Drench is not going to work if the animal doesn't swallow it. The drench is not going to work if the animal gets the wrong amount, either too little, in particular too little. And the drench isn't going to be effective if you damage the lamb in the drenching process and the lamb subsequently dies or becomes very ill from an infection from a drenching gun injury. So I would be saying, when we're dosing these lambs, they're generally very small, 10, 15, 20 kilos. So, take great care with the dosing gun. The amount you're giving is quite small, it's 4 or 6 mils. So calibrating the gun, just making sure that it's delivering, if it's supposed to be delivering 6 mils, that it's actually giving you 6 mils. Those are kind of important things here, just to make sure that you're going to the trouble of dosing them, that it works right. So then look at, 2 parasites we've been discussing. Orla mentioned a lot about Nematodirus. I'm talking about Coccidia. Very, very similar in the way they manifest themselves. Very similar kind of time that they affect. So these are a couple of points there. Look at Nematodirus. We're generally saying 5 to 12 weeks. That's when the lambs start eating grass, and roughly from about 12 weeks on, they become immune. Coccidia, we're saying kind of 3 to 8 weeks. Many of the signs are similar: dark scour, straining. Lambs less than 5 weeks, they're really too young to be eating grass. So if we're seeing it in them, or even if they're lambs that are indoors, then it's definitely coccidia. If they're outdoors, lambs 5 to 8 weeks, it could be either Nematodirus or coccidia. And because the treatment for Nematodirus is much cheaper, the benzimidazole drench is only a couple of cents per dose, whereas the toltrasural or the Vicoxin or Decoxin are much more expensive per treatment. What we're saying is, what you do is you go in with a Nematodirus dose first. If you're not sure, treat them, wait for a day or two. If there's no improvement, then you go in with the coccidia. A lot of farmers go in with both. If they've got a history of the two in the farm, go in with the 2 shots together. A few take-home messages from my talk here this evening. Look at coccidiosis. It can be a severe disease infecting young lambs, and we see that. We see farmers losing lambs. We also see farmers with a lot of lambs, where they have a bad infection, and they subsequently fail to thrive. Poor thrivers, difficult lambs to get finished. Fecal egg counts are not a reliable indicator of infection. The fecal egg counts tell us very little when it comes to coccidia. You could have lambs there with a very, very high fecal egg count, and they could be all from the species of coccidia that don't cause disease. And the converse is true. You could have lambs with a low fecal egg count of coccidiosis, but they could be all from the 2 species causing disease, and those lambs could be very, very sick and really need treatment. So we're not recommending that you go looking for fecal egg counts as the kind of indicator of when you need to treat. If you're in doubt, treat the lambs, as delaying the treatment can lead to permanent damage and poor yield thrift in lambs. Okay, so if there's a history of this on the farm, go in and treat, because otherwise it's going to create with lambs dying and poor thrift. Good hygiene will help reduce that infection and the severity of it. Nutrition is also important to reduce infection pressures. And like always with all diseases, if your lambs are suffering from a number of diseases, from poor nutrition or whatever, they are much more susceptible to any of these parasites. Okay, so getting the basic management right will help. And we sometimes see infections with coccidia and things like that, nematovirus in much older lambs, but it's usually because there's some underlying health condition. There's something gone wrong, and the parasites are coming in on the back because the animals have lost their immunity because they're trying to fight off some other disease. Okay. Use of appropriate drugs to treat infected lambs is an important tool, but should not be overused. And Orla spoke at length there about parasite resistance to stomach worms and nematovirus to anthelmintics. We have 5 different classes of drugs on the anthelmintic side. We have 1 class of drug on the coccidia side. So if that stops working on your farm, very little place to go. There are different products there, but they're all kind of in the same family. So just, take care, use it wisely. Don't be using it if you don't need to use it. And if you have any questions on that, talk to your vet. Thank you, and back to you, Ciaran.
Thanks, Michael. Again, another certainly very timely topic at the moment. I'm sure it's one we'll get more questions on, and we have a few in. So I just encourage our attendees tonight, if you have any questions for Orla, Michael, now's your chance to put them in, and I'll try and put them to. Michael, I'll just start with you. Look, you covered it there at the end. It's a question we get every single year. Which do I dose for first? Should I cover Nematodirus now, or should I dose for both at the one time, and both are risk at this stage?
Yeah, so look, I think, Ciaran, if you have a history of both on your farm, okay, so you're grazing lambs on a platform where there was lambs or calves the previous year, so, and we've had nematovirus every year, and the same if we've had coccidia every year, I think most people are doing is they're going in for both, because it's just a labor issue. You're catching the lambs, you're bringing them in. These small lambs are not easiest to handle and bring in when they're kind of 5 or 6 weeks of age. So I would say where you have a history of both diseases occurring year after year, I'd be going in with both. In the situation where you don't have a history of coccidiosis, I'd be going in with the Nematodirus dose first, and hopefully that's what it is, and they'll dry up. And if they don't dry up, then you're going in a second time.
And that in part covers, David has a question about that. Can Bacox or the other products be used before symptoms appear? So can you just go on a time basis if you know it's an issue in your farm every year?
Yeah, so look at, I suppose they're the same as the anthelmintics. We don't get residual activity, so there's no point in going in, before they have an infection, because they're not going to hold it for anything longer than a few days as the product is making its way down through the digestive tract. But, generally we see coccidia as being a problem between 3 weeks and 8 weeks. A lot of people would be probably going in at 4 or 5 weeks of age, and at that stage, you'll probably have a significant infection if you have this historically on your farm, and you'd be going in with one of those products and cleaning out what's inside there. Yeah.
Okay, I might just ask Orla if she can turn back on camera and come back with us, because we have a few questions that are going to overlap slightly coming in here. Orla, we have you back. So look, there's a question in there about fecal egg counts, and it's relevant to both coccidiosis and nematodirus, and some, even as the season progresses, we'll see frequently results will come back with both. At the moment, for neither of them, though, we're not recommending fecal egg counts. It's symptoms and timing.
Yeah, so in general for nematodirus, with the young lambs, it's the larval stage of the parasite that will do the damage, that will damage the gut, and they can result in death. So you really need to go in before you see the egg counts. What we do use egg counts sometimes for is for testing for resistance, to test whether products have been effective. But in terms of deciding when to dose young lambs, I wouldn't wait until you see nematodirus eggs in a fecal sample, because it might be too late.
Just in part related to that one, I'll just keep you on it. Kevin has a question about fecal egg counts. Can the coccidia eggs not be differentiated to determine risk?
You can distinguish Emira eggs from other types of parasites, but as Michael mentioned in his talk there are lots of different species of Emira infect sheep, and only 2 of them are pathogenic. So when you see an Emira egg down the microscope, you don't know if it comes from a pathogenic Emira or a non-pathogenic Emira. So it doesn't really give you much information as to whether that parasite is a problem or not. So again, not something that I'd be relying on in terms of a diagnostic or to decide when to treat.
Now, Michael, I'll just bring you back in on that one. Like, we will see on the results come back from fecal egg counts, we'll see an indication of the level of coccidia present. You will be using that in conjunction with symptoms, even at a later stage in season, if lambs were struggling a lot.
Look, I think if you were, had a bunch of sick lambs and they were scouring profusely and they were older and we had underlying issues, it can give you an indication. But I think when we're looking at lambs that are scouring in that 3 to 8, 10 week of age, we're not talking about egg counts. We're not talking about egg counts, because the damage is in the case of nematodirus, as Orla said, the damage is done by the time you see the eggs. And in the case of coccidia, we can't, like, we can tell nematodirus eggs very easily. We can tell coccidiosis, but we can't tell what ones they are. We can't tell whether they're from ones that cause disease or not. And I gave the example in my talk. You could have a very high egg count, all from, unlikely to happen, but all from Emira species that don't cause disease, and conversely you could have a very low egg count, but all from really pathogenic, the 2 pathogenic species, and your lambs could be literally dying from coccidia. Like, so it's with these young lambs, we're talking about waiting for 4 or 5 days by the time you get your samples to the lab, and maybe go to the post, a day to get there, a day for the lab to look at it, a day for it to come back. Lambs could be in big trouble. Go in and dose, see what's happening. If you have a history of coccidiosis, it's very simple. If you don't, you're going in with your nematodirus drench first and then seeing to the lambs dry up.
Yeah, quite often, it's diagnosed afterwards based on response to treatment.
Exactly. And look, with both of them conditions, if it's left untreated, the damage we see afterwards can be quite severe. Michael, like, that's just another aspect of it. If they don't treat on time, there is a risk. We see this in some farms that might have a huge issue with coccidia, and certainly on the older lambs. But we've seen occasions where the younger lambs, and some of them really poor doers, or lambs that dried up, not thriving, we see later in the season. Is there a case on certain farms for part treatment of younger lambs in a flock, and are they more at risk than some of the earlier ones that went out first?
Yeah, absolutely. So the younger lambs are really at risk because the older guys have kind of pooed all around the place and made the place dirty for them, particularly if they're not managed as a separate group. And we see this every year. We see farms where we have these tail end lambs, might be 10%, might be 15%. In some cases, it might be 20% of lambs that are poor thrivers. We're taking dung samples off them in the summertime. We're getting no response to minerals. We're getting no response to good grass. They don't have a warm egg count. And you're asking yourself the questions, are these lambs that might have a damaged digestive tract from, a relatively severe coccidia infection, but maybe one that wasn't severe enough to kill lambs, but was severe enough to do damage. Or maybe people went in too late with the treatment or whatever. So I'd be saying, if you're having a problem with lamb thrive, and you've ruled out all the other things, in terms of nutrition and parasites and things like that, your stomachworm parasites now, maybe the coccidia is one that people should start looking at, and again, treating a batch and seeing how that goes is probably the best way.
And them younger lambs really are at risk because the pasture is contaminated. They're essentially going out on, it's being grazed by everything else at that stage. Just maybe Orla, I'll bring in this one, like a question from Brian about your early lambs born in January, showing signs of scouring and dirty, and he's wondering have they any immunity, but just maybe it's more than just maybe Coccidia and Nematodirus that could be hitting them at this stage.
So yes, it could be some of the later season stomach worms. But in order to develop their immunity, they have to be exposed to the parasite. So, if they don't see the parasite, if their immune system doesn't see the parasite, they won't develop immunity. So in order for them to develop immunity, they have to have that early exposure. So if they haven't had that, they could still be susceptible even at 3 months of age. Also, these older lambs, they could be starting to encounter some of the other parasites, the Teagasc, the Trichostrongylus. Some of these other parasites may also become a problem.
Yeah, and again, the pasture might have been clean enough for Nematodirus early on, so that's still a risk. Michael, there's a question in here on it's that whole risk of dosing for both, and frequently we'll see it happen. It's not a nice age to be handling a lot of lambs at the dose, but there is no dose that will cover both Cocci and Nematodirus. And I suppose it in part ties into another question, to avoid mixing them doses if you are going to go with both at one time.
Yeah, okay. So, it's not, and those small little lambs when you're bringing them in the first time, anyone that knows the first time you bring the lambs into the yard with the oats, that's the hardest day work you're going to do. They're small, slippery little lads, hard enough to hold on to, everything is much smaller with them. In terms of doing this, you have to, you need 2 dosing guns, you need 2 bottles, and you can't mix. And there's no way of sugarcoating that for anyone here on the call. It is not going to work if you mix it. You can't mix those 2 products together. You can dose them sequentially, one after the other, down the throat, but certainly you can't mix 2 bottles, shake it up, and expect this to work. It's a disaster. It's going to lead to lots of other issues, and it's absolutely not recommended. I can't stress that highly enough.
And look, it's just going to be one of them really awkward, busy days that we have to face during the year. Look, just in part on that, and you did touch on in your presentation, the care of that dosing technique, particularly with young lambs, and guns are maybe a bit more suitable for older ones. We frequently get reports back of damaged larynx and that from the regional veterinary lab. It really is a time you just need to take care with technique as well.
Yeah. Look, we had a call there about a month ago with one of the vets from the RVLs, and he showed us lots of different pictures. And basically the problems that arise in the throat area of the lamb from the dosing gun. So the dosing gun causes an injury there, and the infection builds up, and then maybe the lamb chokes because it just becomes so big and the food can't be digested, or the food when they start cutting, builds up there, and then the bacteria invade the tissue and the lambs die. So really look at the reason why we want to be very careful dosing is the first thing is we want the dose to work. And if we're not careful dosing, the lambs won't swallow the dose. We won't get the right amount of dose into them. So we need, for it to work, we need the lambs to get the right amount of dose and to swallow it. And that's why we need to be slow and gentle and careful and calibrate the dosing gun. And then the second thing that we're trying to do when we're dosing the lambs is we're trying not to injure them and kill them. And that sounds maybe a bit silly, but the RVL work would show that there's quite a number of sheep brought into the RVLs every year that die unexpectedly or unexplained. And when they look at them, it's a dosing gun injury. So look at, if you're in a rush, it's not the time to do this job. This is the job that you do on a day when you have the time. You do it properly. You take your time. And I know that's easy said, on farms this time of the year. It's a busy time, maybe cows still calving, maybe some ewes still lambing, fertilizer to spread, all those things. But this is the job that you need to take your time on, do it properly, and make sure it works, and that your lambs will be healthy and fit afterwards. Yeah. So gentle is the name of the game here, Ciaran.
No, I think that's good advice. And look, I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to take one final question. Orla, if we can just go back to the whole area of dosing ewes, and maybe just for a point of clarification, and yearling ewes will be one of them caveats. Suckling yearling ewes, ewe lambs were mated last year. They're still susceptible, and they're probably one of the few groups that sit outside of that recommendation.
Yeah, so I think, if you look at that recommendation, the way it says not to treat mature ewes for gutworms unless there is a demonstrated need. So there are particular groups of animals that may need treatment. And one of those groups, as you just mentioned there, Ciaran, would be lactating yearling ewes. So as I said, it takes, about a year for sheep to develop immunity to gutworms. If you have a lactating yearling ewe, there's normally a suppression of immunity around parturition anyway. If you add on top of that, that it's a yearling who maybe hasn't fully developed immunity, you can have quite a suppression of immunity. So they're a group of animals that probably would warrant treatment. And there are a few other groups of animals. So, if it's a farm that maybe has haemoncus, a problem with haemoncus, so that's a parasite that's quite rare in Ireland, but it is known that there are certain farms that might have issues in certain years with haemoncus and haemoncus outbreaks, and they might lose ewes because they have no immunity to haemoncus. So that would be another exception to that rule. Or if you have, ewes that are particularly thin or in poor condition, then it's perfectly fine to go and treat them. In that case, you're targeting the treatment at the individual ewe who's thin. You're not blanket treating the whole ewe flock. If the whole ewe flock needs treatment for worms, then as Michael mentioned, there's possibly some other underlying health or nutrition issue there that's causing them to be immunocompromised and causing them to be susceptible to gutworms. And I suppose just the other point to just throw in there while I'm at it is that we are specifically talking now about not dosing ewes for gutworms. Fluke is a different story.
No, I suppose in any of them cases, or again, making sure that treatment is effective for your individual farm is key. We are going to treat them ewes.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So every treatment that you give, you want to use a product that works. One of the fastest ways to develop resistance is to use an ineffective product. So you always want to use a product that's working.
I'm just conscious we're approached the hours we are. So look, I think we'll have to draw to a close for tonight. And again, look, I would like to thank Orla and Michael. I think we're very clear. It's timely information at the moment. And hopefully it was of use to our attendees tonight. You'll get a couple of good take-home messages from it. This webinar is recorded, so the recording will be available on the Teagasc website in the coming days. So I would like to thank everyone who attended tonight, particularly those that asked questions. Again, I hope it was some benefit to you. We will be back in a month's time on the 6th of May. We're going to be focusing on silage quality, how to make that high quality silage, what role it has in sheep systems, and various aspects around that. So that's going to be on the 6th of May. Again, it'll be flagged on our social media channels and not before. And so with that, look, I'd like to thank everyone that came on tonight, thank our panelists, and we'll wrap it up with that. So.